In June of 2016, I had just completed my MBA in Boston. And I was about to start a job in 2 months at Apple in California on the iPhone team, when I was approached by an old high school friend of mine, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. He was telling me about his new startup. He said it's going to start in food delivery. We're then going to expand to other verticals. And then eventually we're going to create a powerful logistics infrastructure. He said the startup was called Carriage. I said, well, listen, this sounds really great, but I'm about to start a job in 2 months. And I'm moving to California, so maybe I'll call you in a year and a half, 2 years, when I'm thinking of moving back to Kuwait. And then we can discuss where you've been and how you guys are progressing and see where it's the best fit for me. He said, okay, sounds good. And the role he had offered me was co-founder of the company. Now, some of you may know this story already, but Carriage took its first customer order that same month in June, and in about 13 months was purchased by Delivery Hero for $180 million. So not only did I miss out on an incredible growth and learning story, but also on my retirement fund. My name is Abdulaziz Albahar. I'm an engineer by background, and I've worked in a variety of industries, spanning multiple countries. Today, I'd like to talk to you about 3 concepts: the concept of risk, failure, and the concept of a career. Photo sharing startup Flickr and instant messaging tool Slack both ended up as a result of very risky last-minute pivots to the original idea. What's a pivot? A pivot is when you're going down a certain path and you have to quickly change direction because that path is not working out. Flickr started as a social online game. The founders actually mortgaged their house, took out a loan in order to continue funding the game, and they were almost out of money. They got to a point where they just had a month left, and they said, you know what? We're going to focus on one feature within the game, which is a photo sharing feature that users could use to message each other and share photos. They turned that into a social photo sharing platform, and it took off. Flickr was then sold for tens of millions of dollars just a few years later. Slack is also known for great success now, but also started as a social online game. The founders started it, didn't run out of money, they actually just ran out of users. No one would use the game. They shut down the company and announced it was a failure. But in this case, they did have some money in the bank account. So they spoke to their investors, got permission to use the rest of the money, and then actually commercialized an internal messaging tool that they had developed inside Slack to communicate with remote employees who weren't at headquarters. They commercialized that tool, that became Slack, and 7 years later, it was acquired for $27 billion. Uber and Airbnb, household names today, both went through a ton of regulatory issues, even failures and shutdown in many of the cities that they launched in. Over time, those companies fought those regulatory issues, persevered, took lots of risk launching in those cities, and are now each worth $70 billion. But not all stories are like this, right? You could risk your money investing in a company that you think is going to be very successful, then that company might fail, you will lose everything. You could risk your reputation, starting a company, collecting money from investors, growing it, scaling it, hiring employees, only to then have that company fail, and you lose everything. So why take any risk in the first place? This does not sound like fun. Well, because of regret. You see, risk and regret are 2 sides of the same seesaw. When you go heavy on the risk, you minimize regret. In fact, Jeff Bezos, his sole reason for starting Amazon, the one thing that got him to actually go ahead and start the company, was he didn't want to look back on his life when he was 80 years old and regret not going ahead and not at least trying to start it. So risk is powerful, but regret can sometimes be an even more powerful motivator. So in that case, why don't people take risks? Well, because of failure. People are afraid to fail. If you fail at something, you're going to have to spend the rest of your life in every job interview saying, well, I failed because this, and that. This is why I failed. This was the reason we didn't succeed. And people don't really enjoy that, right? It's not fun to say that. But I'd argue that failure is actually more important than success. In fact, if you don't fail, you can't succeed. They're actually two sides of the same coin. Famous author Daniel Pink published a book recently about regret, where he interviewed 19,000 people about all their regrets in life. One of the top culprits was not being bold enough, aka not taking enough risk. Now, risk is a tricky concept, right? It's not something that people like to do because of failure. But a number of years ago, the concept of a failure resume was popularized. So basically, you have your CV, which everyone knows. It's your LinkedIn profile, your CV, your resume. It lists all your milestones, your accomplishments, all the great things you did, the certifications. This is a mirror of that, except for all your failures. And trust me, it's going to be a much longer list. Mine is. So these are all the things you didn't happen, jobs you didn't get, things you didn't achieve. But what's the point of this, right? The goal isn't to glorify your failures. It's actually to learn from them. So it's proven that if you take these, you write them down, and then you look at each one, you'll be able to actually do better in the future, to fail better in the future, and to eventually succeed. Take the example of someone who didn't do a good job on a presentation at work. They're going to feel bad, but if they write it down, understand that the presentation was due to a lack of preparation, not enough time practicing, then the fix is easy. Prepare more, practice ahead of time, and that's it. So you no longer feel bad about failing at that presentation. Similarly, imagine if you're an academic, you're giving a talk, or you're publishing a research paper, and it's a peer-reviewed journal. You spend 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times submitting that paper, and it gets rejected every time. On the 7th time, it finally gets accepted and published. The next time you go to publish a paper, guess what? You're going to remember that it might take a few tries, and you're going to understand the reasons why it got rejected in the first place. So you won't be afraid to try. But failure is a very tricky and touchy subject. Same goes for investing. Bessemer Venture Partners is one of the oldest venture capital firms in the world. And they have on their website what they call an anti-portfolio. So if you go to any investment website, you'll see, here are the companies we invest in, here's our portfolio. And what venture capitalists like to do is they like to also put a check or a certain color code next to all the companies that have exited or succeeded or done very well, just to show off. Bessemer has that, but they also have an anti-portfolio, which are all the companies they passed on. They did not accept, they did not fund, they rejected. That's a great list, including Apple, Facebook, PayPal, eBay, FedEx. So imagine if you had passed on all those investments. Doesn't feel good, right? But why do they do that? They don't only have the companies, they actually have the reasons, a little story for what happened with each company, why they rejected it. They passed on FedEx not once, not twice, but 7 times. They passed on Tesla. One of the partners actually drove the very first Tesla Roadster, loved the car, decided not to invest in the company, but he put down a deposit on the car. And his logic, word for word, was, this is a win-win situation. I get to drive the car, and some other VC gets to pay for it. Tesla is now worth $500 billion today. And that guy paid full price for his car. But what's the goal of this? Why do they do this? They do this because Bessemer still exists today, still a great venture capital firm. They do this because they want to learn from those mistakes and go on to make better investments in the future. And you know, it's okay, you can still have a very successful career that includes failure. In fact, I'd argue that our careers are actually a series of failures with a sprinkling of success in between. We just choose to highlight the success and hide the failures. In fact, if you look at the documents that people use, I mean, let's actually first look at the definition of a career. If you go online, you search for a career, you're going to get very boring definitions, like a number of milestones, a bunch of positions with growth in between. The one I subscribe to is a career is a process of continuous learning, development, and growth. That's it. And if you look at the document that most people use to describe their careers, 99% of people have a resume, a CV, a LinkedIn profile. What does that document include? It includes A list of milestones, list of achievements, things you've done, places you've gone to school. But it hides something, not intentionally, but something very important, which are all the decisions that you made in between these milestones. So take the example of my role or my rejection of my role at Carriage. That's not on my resume. The jobs you didn't take are not on your CV. If you chose to move to a city to pursue a role, or move back home to be closer to family or to take care of a sick relative, and that's why you're taking that job in that city, that's not on your CV. If you went to a college, and the reason you went to that college was because that's the only one you could afford, but you did get into better schools, that's not on your CV. The only thing that's on your CV is where you went to school. So it's important to understand this real CV, the real resume that overlies your actual resume. It takes a black and white CV and puts it into color, gives it perspective, mandur. Just like regret gives risk a whole new perspective, just like failure gives success and career a whole new perspective. So what do we learn from this? Take risks if you can. Even if it's to minimize regret, you will maximize happiness in the long run. Number 2, a career always looks better in hindsight, always makes sense in hindsight. When you're making a big decision, it's going to look like a mountain. It's going to look difficult, scary, unsurmountable. But once you finish your career, only when you cross the finish line, you're going to look back and you're going to see, okay, this is a straight line, it's a path, it makes complete sense. But it will only make sense when you're done. And then finally, keep a failure resume. It will help you learn from your failures, fail better the next time, and it will fuel your success. Thank you.